The front door slammed against Ethan Cole's wall just as lightning split the Montana sky, and a woman stumbled across his threshold with rain pouring from her hair and blood bright on one scraped palm. Ethan caught her before she fell. It was Clara Whitmore, his nearest neighbor, the woman who had spent 6 years proving she could run a ranch without anyone's help. Her dress was soaked through. One shoe was half unlaced, and when thunder struck again, she seized Ethan's arm with both hands. Behind her, the storm was tearing branches from the cottonwoods, and somewhere beyond the creek, a pine had already come down beside her house. "Please," Clara gasped, "don't send me back yet." Ethan had never heard fear in her voice before. He pulled her inside, shoved the door closed against the wind, and dropped the heavy wooden bar into place. Clara stood dripping onto his floorboards, while Ethan crossed to the nearest window. Through the rain, he could barely make out the black shape of the creek below the hill, swollen wider than it had been an hour earlier. Something had driven Clara from her own home in weather dangerous enough to kill a rider, and Ethan knew the fallen tree was not the whole answer. Another flash turned the room white. Clara flinched so hard that her shoulder struck the wall. Ethan said nothing about it. He took the old wool blanket from the chair beside the iron stove and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Sit down." She tried to protest. He gave her the look he used on frightened horses when arguing only made things worse. "That wasn't a request, ma'am." Clara sank into the chair, breathing slowly through clenched teeth, while Ethan fed 2 more pieces of split pine into the stove. If you had known Clara Whitmore, you might have understood why the sight would have stopped you cold. This was a woman who repaired her own fence posts, hauled her own winter feed, and once walked nearly 8 miles after a horse threw a shoe. People in the valley called her stubborn when they meant capable. They called her proud when they meant alone. Yet now every roll of thunder made her fingers close tighter around that blanket. Ethan filled a tin cup of hot coffee and placed it in her hands. "Tree hit the house?" Clara nodded. "Near enough. Broke a window. Spooked the mare." She stared into the cup. "I tried staying." That last sentence came out quieter. Ethan lowered himself into the chair across from her. Years earlier, a storm had taught him what happened when a man mistook stubbornness for courage. He had no intention of making Clara prove anything tonight. "You can stay here until it passes." She looked toward the dark window. Rain hammered the roof hard enough to drown the ticking clock. "It may not pass before morning." Ethan leaned back. "Then you stay until morning." For the first time since entering, Clara looked directly at him. Thunder rolled across the valley, low and long. Her hand trembled around the cup, but this time she did not look away. "Ethan," she swallowed, "I feel safer with you." He had no answer ready for that. Before he could find one, a violent crack sounded somewhere close to the house, followed by the heavy crash of timber. Ethan rose immediately and reached for the lantern. Whatever the storm had already taken from Clara's place, it was not finished with the valley yet, and before morning came, Ethan would learn why the strongest woman he knew had crossed a flooded field just to reach his door. Ethan lifted the lantern and checked the windows before stepping onto the porch. The crash had come from the cottonwood beside his shed. One of its heavy limbs had torn loose and fallen across the path, but the house and barn still stood. He did not stay outside long. Rain had already turned the yard into black mud, and the creek below the hill was climbing. By the time he barred the door again, Clara had managed to stop shivering, though she still held the tin cup with both hands. Ethan hung his wet coat beside the stove and said, "Nobody ought to be crossing that creek tonight." Clara gave a tired nod. "I barely crossed it the first time." He found an old wool shirt in a chest near his bedroom door and set it beside her without ceremony. "You'll catch cold sitting in that dress." Clara looked at the shirt, then at him. "And what exactly do you propose I do about that?" Ethan turned his back and pointed toward the small bedroom. "Change. I'll stay out here." There was no teasing in his voice, no awkwardness he allowed himself to show. Clara disappeared behind the door, and Ethan busied himself with the stove until she returned wearing his faded gray shirt over her dry petticoat and skirt. The sleeves reached past her hands. For some reason, the sight made the room feel less empty than it had 5 minutes earlier. Ethan took onions, potatoes, and a piece of salted beef from the pantry. Clara watched him struggle with a dull kitchen knife for nearly half a minute before finally saying, "Give me that before you injure yourself." He handed it over. She began cutting the onions with the quick, practiced movements of someone who had spent years feeding herself through winters when supplies had to last. Ethan put a skillet on the stove. Between them, without discussion, a meal took shape: beef stewed with potatoes and onions, corn cakes browned in bacon grease, and coffee strong enough to keep a tired ranch hand awake through calving season. The storm still shook the windows, but inside the cabin another rhythm slowly took over. Clara's knife against the cutting board, Ethan moving iron pots across the stove, the faint hiss of rainwater drying from their clothes. Ethan had eaten hundreds of meals at that table alone. Usually he stood at the counter, finished quickly, washed one plate, and went back to whatever work remained. Tonight there were 2 cups, 2 bowls, 2 chairs pulled close to fire. He found himself noticing things he had long stopped noticing: the smell of brown cornmeal, the sound of another person breathing between sentences, the simple comfort of passing salt across a table. Clara tasted the stew and frowned. "Needs pepper." Ethan slid the tin toward her. "You always is demanding when somebody saves you from a storm. You didn't save me." "No." "You opened the door." Ethan considered that. "Seems like you needed one opened." Her expression changed for half a second, the sharp reply disappearing before it reached her lips. Then thunder broke directly overhead. The spoon slipped from Clara's hand and struck the bowl. Ethan did not move toward her. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply reached down, picked up the spoon, wiped on a cloth, and set it beside her plate. Clara stared at her hands. "The tree was why I came here." Ethan sat back down. Outside, wind drove rain beneath the porch roof. He waited. He had learned a long time ago that frightened animals and frightened people shared one useful truth: forcing either of them closer usually drove them farther away. Clara finally spoke. 10 years ago, my father went out during a storm like this." Her voice was steady only because she was making it steady. "Cattle broke through the north fence. He thought if he could turn them before they reached the creek, he could save half our winter herd." She looked toward the stove rather than Ethan. "I begged him to wait until daylight. He told me he'd ridden through worse." Another rumble rolled across the valley. Clara's fingers closed over the edge of the table. "He never came home." Ethan said nothing. "I found his coat the next morning," she continued. "Caught on barbed wire near the lower pasture. They found him farther downstream." She took a breath. "Ever since then, when thunder gets close enough, I hear that door shutting behind him again." Her mouth tightened with embarrassment. "Nobody knows. Not Martha. Not the sheriff. Nobody." She looked at Ethan almost defiantly. "People around here expect you to be strong. Being afraid doesn't make you weak." Clara gave a humorless little smile. "Then why do I feel ashamed of it?" Ethan looked down at his own hands. On the shelf behind Clara sat an old brass pocket watch that had not run in years. It had belonged to Ethan's younger brother, Daniel, who had died after trying to move horses during a spring storm 17 years earlier. Ethan almost never spoke his name. He had spent too many years believing that caution, afterward, could somehow repay one reckless night before. His eyes rested on the watch, then returned to Clara, because somewhere along the way, somebody convinced you strength means never needing anyone. The words left the room quiet except for fire. Clara looked at him for a long time. She did not thank him. Ethan did not expect her to. Instead, she reached for her coffee and discovered that her hand was no longer trembling. They finished supper slowly, talking about ordinary things: the damaged window at her house, the mare that had bolted, whether the feed shed roof had survived. Ethan did not tell Clara that he was deliberately keeping the conversation ordinary. She did not tell him she understood. Near midnight, Ethan gave her the bedroom and carried a quilt to the chair beside the stove. Clara objected twice before realizing he would not change his mind. When she finally closed the bedroom door, Ethan placed his rifle within reach. Not because he expected trouble from a man, but because storms had a way of turning ordinary problems into dangerous ones. He listened to the rain weaken sometime before dawn. Morning revealed what darkness had hidden. The clouds were breaking over the mountains, but the valley below was littered with broken limbs and washed-out fence rails. From Ethan's porch, Clara could see part of her property across the swollen creek. One section of the barn roof was missing. A pine lay across the feed shed. Even from that distance, she knew the damage would take weeks to repair. "I can handle it," she said. Ethan reached for his coat and tool belt. Clara turned toward him. "I said I can handle it." "I heard you. Then where are you going?" Ethan opened the door and looked toward the battered ranch across the creek. "With you?" And as Clara followed him into the cold morning, neither of them knew that the storm had damaged more than timber and fences. It had shown Walter Briggs exactly when her land would be easiest to take. By noon, Ethan and Clara had crossed the creek and reached what the storm had left of her ranch. The east side of the barn roof had peeled back like torn tin. 2 fence lines lay flat beneath branches. Rain had poured through the broken kitchen window and soaked the floorboards, and the pine that Clara had heard fall during the night now rested across the feed shed, crushing one corner beneath its weight. Clara stood in the yard with her sleeves rolled up and studied the damage without complaint. Ethan watched her count repairs the way another person might count debts. "Roof first," she said. "Then the window. Fence can wait." Ethan set down his tools. "Feed shed first. Another rain and you'll lose what's inside." Clara looked at him, considered arguing, then nodded. They worked until their hands were raw. Ethan climbed onto the barn roof, while Clara passed shingles and nails from below. When he came down, she had already cleared broken glass from the kitchen and stretched oilcloth over the window frame. At dusk, she cooked beef, onions, and the last sound potatoes from a storage bin that had escaped the rain. Ethan intended to ride home after supper. Instead, he stayed long enough to reset the crooked barn door. Clara did not ask him to stay. She merely placed a second plate on the table before he had decided whether he was hungry. That became the shape of the next several days. Ethan arrived after finishing his morning chores, worked beside Clara until sundown, and ate whatever she put before him. Cornbread, beans with salt pork, leftover stew thickened the second day, biscuits baked in a Dutch oven when the stove finally dried. They spoke mostly about practical things. Fence posts. Aye, horses. Whether the creek would rise again. But something quiet had changed between them. Clara no longer apologized when she handed Ethan a hammer. Ethan no longer pretended he was helping only because the work needed doing. On the 4th afternoon, a polished bay gelding appeared on the road. Walter Briggs rode into the yard wearing a dark wool coat untouched by mud. He owned more land than any man within 20 miles, much of it bought from ranchers who had suffered one bad winter too many. Briggs did not raise his voice, and he rarely needed to. He carried pressure the way other men carried a revolver, visible enough that everyone understood it was there. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Briggs." His gaze moved over the damaged barn, the crushed shed, and finally Ethan, who was driving a new hinge into the gate. "Storm treated you poorly." "I've seen worse." Briggs smiled as though Clara had made a charming mistake. "Perhaps, but repairs cost money whether a person fears them or not." He removed a folded paper from inside his coat. Clara did not take it. "My previous offer still stands," he said. "Considering the damage, I'd call it generous." "You called it generous before the damage. And you called it insulting." "I remember." Briggs looked toward the creek that cut across Clara's property before running south into his own grazing land. Even in dry years, that water rarely failed. Ethan had always suspected Briggs wanted the ranch for that reason, but now there was nothing subtle about the way the man studied it. "You can't run this place alone forever," Briggs said. Clara's jaw tightened. Then Briggs glanced toward Ethan. "Unless Cole plans on doing all your work for you." The hammer stopped in Ethan's hand. Clara answered before he could. "Mr. Cole is my neighbor." "Of course." Something in Briggs's tone made the word dirtier than an accusation. Clara stepped closer. "You have your answer." I am not selling. For a moment, Briggs's polite expression disappeared. Not anger exactly. Calculation. Then the smile returned. Winter has a way of changing a person's arithmetic. He tucked the paper back into his coat, mounted his horse, and rode toward the road without another word. Ethan watched until the gelding disappeared beyond the cottonwoods. He wants the water, he said. I know. He'll come back. I know that too. Clara gathered the loose nails from the ground more sharply than necessary. Ethan could see embarrassment building beneath her anger. Clara, she faced him. I appreciate what you've done. He waited, but I need to finish the rest myself. Ethan's expression did not change. Because Briggs said something foolish? Because other people will say it too. Let them. You can. The words came harder than she intended. Clara lowered her voice. You're a man with your own ranch. Nobody looks at you working beside another person and wonders whether you're capable of standing on your own. If people see you here every day, they won't say we repaired this place together. They'll say Ethan Cole saved Clara Whitmore because she couldn't manage. I don't think that. That isn't the point. Ethan looked at the half-repaired fence between them. He could have argued. He could have told her that people who wanted to gossip required no evidence. But the night of the storm had taught him enough to know that pushing against Clara's pride would only make her defend harder. So he placed a hammer on the gate post. All right. Clara seemed almost disappointed that he agreed. You'll stay away? If that's what you want. It is... Ethan nodded once. Then I'll respect it. He mounted his horse and rode home before dark. For the first time since the storm, Clara ate alone. The silence bothered her more than she expected. Across the valley, Ethan discovered the same thing. His cabin had not changed. The same iron stove stood against the wall. The same clock ticked above the shelf. The same chair waited beside the fire. Yet the place felt different now that he knew exactly what was missing from it. He found Clara's tin coffee cup on the shelf where he had placed it after washing the morning after the storm. He almost laughed at himself. Instead, he left it there. For more than a week, he kept his distance. Then Samuel Reed rode out from town. The sheriff dismounted beside Ethan's barn and accepted coffee without explaining why he had come. Samuel had known Ethan long enough to understand that silence usually brought the truth faster. Finally, he said, Briggs was at the county office yesterday. Ethan looked up, asking about Whitmore's property lines. Water rights, too. Anything unlawful? Not yet. That answer troubled Ethan more than a simple yes would have. Samuel rubbed a hand across his gray beard. A man like Briggs doesn't usually ask questions unless he already knows what answer he wants. Ethan stared through the open barn door toward Clara's ranch. What's he planning? Couldn't tell you. Samuel mounted again, then paused. But I keep an eye on that creek. 3 mornings later, Clara found the first cut in her north fence. Not broken by wind. Not pushed down by cattle. Cut cleanly through with wire nippers. 2 of her horses had wandered nearly a mile before she found them. She repaired the fence alone and told no one. The following evening, she discovered another section cut, this time closer to the creek. Clara stood in the fading light with a length of severed wire in her hand, knowing exactly what Briggs wanted her to believe, that every day she remained on that ranch would cost her more than the day before. She still did not go to Ethan. But the next morning, Ethan rode past a ridge and saw fresh hoofprints near her northern boundary. They were not Clara's. He followed them until they turned toward land belonging to Walter Briggs. Ethan sat motionless in the saddle. Briggs did not merely want Clara's ranch because she was vulnerable after the storm. He intended to make certain she stayed vulnerable long enough to sell it. And Ethan now faced the one thing Clara had specifically asked him not to do, interfere. Ethan did not ride onto Clara's property that morning. He followed the unfamiliar hoofprints only far enough to be certain they crossed onto Briggs' land, then turned his horse toward town. Clara had asked him not to interfere, and he intended to honor the part of that request that belonged to her pride. But cut fence wire was no longer a matter of pride. By noon, Sheriff Samuel Reed had inspected the tracks himself. He crouched beside the northern fence, lifted one cleanly severed strand, and frowned. "This prove Briggs cut it?" Ethan asked. "No. Prove somebody did." "That it does." Samuel wrapped the damaged wire in a scrap of canvas. "I'll speak to him." Ethan looked toward Clara's house. "She know?" "Not for me." Samuel studied him. "You're making this difficult on yourself. She asked me to stay out of her affairs. And you're standing outside them?" Ethan glanced at the fence. "Close as I can manage." Samuel rode away with the wire, and Ethan returned home. For the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. That was almost worse. Clara repaired her remaining storm damage alone. Ethan saw her sometimes from his upper pasture, a small figure carrying boards between barn and house, or riding the boundary with a hammer looped at her saddle. He never crossed the creek. When they met on the road, they exchanged polite greetings that sounded more like strangers than two people who had once shared coffee while thunder shook the walls. Then the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon. Ethan noticed it first in the horses. They turned restless before sunset, crowding the eastern side of the pasture with their backs to the wind. Clouds lowered over the mountains until the peaks disappeared. The air smelled metallic and sharp. Early snow. Too early. Ethan had just finished securing his barn when movement near the southern fence caught his attention. A chestnut mare came galloping to the gray light, reins trailing from its bridle. Clara's madre. Ethan was in the saddle less than 5 minutes later. Snow began falling before he reached the creek. By the time he crossed, it came sideways. He found Clara behind her barn, halfway up a ladder, trying to lash a loose roof beam before the wind tore it free. "Clara." She looked down. "What are you doing here? Get off that ladder." "I have it." A gust struck the barn. The loose beam shifted. Ethan saw it before she did. "Move." The timber dropped. Clara twisted away, but the ladder kicked sideways beneath her. She fell hard into the snow as the beam crashed where she had been standing. Ethan jumped from his horse and reached her. "I'm fine." "You haven't even tried standing yet." "I said I'm fine." She pushed herself upright, took one step, and nearly collapsed. Ethan caught her around the waist. Pain flashed across her face. "Ankle?" "Leg. Just above it." He crouched and checked carefully. Nothing appeared broken, but swelling was already forming beneath her stocking. Clara pulled away. "I told you I can handle this." Ethan stood. "I know." "Then why are you here?" Snow caught in his hair and melted down the side of his face. "Because being able to do something alone doesn't mean you should have to." The anger left her expression so quickly that Ethan almost wished he had chosen different words. For several seconds, she simply looked at him. Then another gust slammed against the barn. Ethan pointed toward the house. "You can argue with me inside. I can walk. You can limp. I can still walk." He let her. That mattered. Ethan stayed close enough to catch her as she fell, but he did not touch her again until she reached the porch and accepted his arm without being asked. By dusk, the valley had vanished behind White. There would be no riding home. Ethan secured Clara's shutters, checked the barn once more, and brought enough wood inside for the night. When he returned, Clara was at the stove despite her injured leg. "You're supposed to be sitting. You're supposed to be at your own house." Snow disagreed. "That makes 2 of you." He almost smiled. Clara made biscuits in a lasso flour sack, warmed salted beef in a skillet, simmered beans with onion, then put sliced apples into a small iron pot with brown sugar and cinnamon. Soon the cabin smelled of warm bread and spice. Ethan sat at her table, while Clara moved carefully between stove and cupboard. The scene felt strangely familiar, only reversed. Weeks earlier she had sat in his house, wrapped in his shirt, while rain beat against the roof. Now Ethan was a stranded neighbor, and Clara was the one putting food in front of him. They ate while snow covered the windows. Halfway through supper, Clara set down her fork. Samuel spoke to Briggs. Ethan looked at her. "You knew." "I saw the sheriff ride past." Ethan waited. "Briggs came here afterward," she said. He denied touching the fence. Expected he would. He also made another offer. Ethan's jaw tightened. Higher? Much. He said nothing. Clara studied him. Aren't you going to tell me not to sell? No, that answer surprised her. You think I should? I think it's your land. That isn't what I asked. Ethan leaned back slightly. You want to know what I want? Yes. He looked toward the dark window. I want Briggs nowhere near that creek. I want you to stop climbing ladders in storms. And I'd rather not spend another winter watching smoke rise from your chimney and wondering whether you'll let me cross the fence without biting my head off. Clara lowered her eyes. But whether you sell is yours to decide. The stove ticked softly. Do you ever get lonely? She asked. Ethan's expression changed. It was not a question about land anymore. He took his time answering. I used to think loneliness was peaceful. Clara looked at him. And now I know there's a difference. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Outside, the storm pressed against the house. Inside, Clara divided the last apple between their bowls. By morning, nearly a foot of snow covered the yard. The storm passed, but Briggs's offer remained, and for the first time, Clara considered taking it, not because she believed Briggs deserved the ranch, because she was tired. She was tired of broken roofs, cut fences, winters that arrived before the hay was ready, and waking before daylight because every chore belonged to her alone. Weeks later, after the snow melted enough for travel, Briggs returned. This time his offer was nearly twice the first. Clara held the paper in her kitchen for a long time after he left. With that money, she could buy a small house near town. She could help Martha at the restaurant if she wished. She could sleep through storms without worrying about livestock or roofs. She could live where another human voice was never more than a few doors away. The next afternoon, she rode to Ethan's ranch. He was repairing a section of fence when she found him. I may sell. The hammer stopped. Ethan looked at her. Clara had expected something, a protest, disappointment, perhaps even anger. Instead, he asked, Is that what you want? I don't know. Then don't sign anything until you do. That's all you have to say. Ethan set the hammer down. Whatever you choose, make sure it's because it's what you want, not because you're afraid. Clara stared at him. The words reached farther than Briggs's offer, farther than the ranch, farther even than that storm 10 years ago. For years, fear had worn so many disguises she no longer recognized it. Sometimes it sounded like thunder. Sometimes it sounded like pride. Sometimes it told her accepting help made her weak. And now it was telling her that leaving would finally make life safe. That evening, Clara placed Briggs's offer on her stove. She struck a match. The corner blackened. Then the whole paper curled into flame. The following morning, she rode into town and found Walter Briggs outside the mercantile with Sheriff Reed standing nearby. I'm not selling, Clara said. Briggs smiled thinly. Winter isn't over. No, you may reconsider. No. His gaze shifted to Ethan, who had arrived several minutes earlier but remained beside his horse. Briggs gave a quiet laugh. So Cole convinced you. Clara stepped closer. No, Mr. Briggs. That is exactly what you never understood. People on the boardwalk went still. This ranch belonged to my family before you wanted its water. I repaired it before Ethan helped me, and I will repair it after he goes home. If I keep it, that choice is mine. If I someday leave it, that choice will be mine too. Samuel moved beside Briggs. And those fences? Briggs's smile faded. The sheriff removed a piece of cut wire from his coat. One of your hired hands finally decided losing a job was better than answering for property damage. He told me who ordered him north of Whitmore Creek. For one dangerous moment, Briggs said nothing. Then he looked toward the men gathered near the livery. No one looked away. That was the moment his advantage broke. Not because Ethan had threatened him. Not because Clara needed rescuing. Because a man Briggs had paid chose to speak. A sheriff chose to listen, and Clara stood in public without allowing Briggs to make her decision for her. Briggs was ordered to pay for the damaged fencing and warned that another trespass complaint will be taken before the county judge. His effort to pressure Clara ended there, not with gunfire, but with witnesses, evidence, and a town that had finally seen enough. Ethan did not celebrate. He simply walked Clara to her horse. She placed one boot in the stirrup, then paused. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not telling me what to do." Ethan nodded. "Figured you'd tell me eventually." She smiled. Spring arrived slowly. Snow withdrew from the valley in dirty patches, exposing grass flattened beneath the winter. Clara's roof held. Her horses were healthy. The creek ran full between the two ranches. One afternoon, Ethan found her replacing rails along the boundary fence. He took the opposite end without asking. They worked for nearly an hour before Clara noticed he had been unusually slow setting the last post. "You ever going to finish fixing this fence?" Ethan leaned on the post. "Maybe I don't want to." She looked at him. He rubbed a thumb over the worn handle of his hammer. "Seems to me this fence doesn't matter quite as much as it used to." Clara's cheeks warmed. Ethan looked toward her ranch, then back at her. "That night you came to my house, you told me you felt safer with me. I remember. I've been thinking about that ever since." "Why?" He took a breath. "Because somehow my house started feeling more like home after you walked into it." Clara stood very still. Then she laid the fence rail down. "There's something I never told you about that night." Ethan waited. "I could have gone into the root cellar. It was closer." He said nothing. "I could have stayed in the barn, too. Probably. But when the thunder started, I didn't think about either place." She stepped closer. "I wasn't looking for shelter." Ethan's voice dropped. "What were you looking for?" Clara looked straight at him. "You." The unfinished fence stood between them. For once, neither made any effort to repair it. Clara did not move across the fence that afternoon. Neither did Ethan. For a long moment, they simply stood there with the unfinished rail between them, listening to water run beneath the cottonwoods where the spring thaw had filled the creek. Ethan had spent most of his adult life believing that some things were safer left unsaid. Clara had spent nearly as long believing that needing another person was a debt she could not afford. Yet there they were, two people who had survived by standing alone, finally admitting that survival and living were not the same thing. Ethan rested one hand on the fence post. "I don't want you to think I'm asking for your ranch." Clara almost smiled. "I know. I don't want your land." "I know that, too." He looked toward his house on the ridge. "What I want is for you to come to supper, without needing a storm as an excuse." That earned the smile. Clara picked up the loose fence rail, considered it, then set it back on the grass. All right. That was how it began. Not with a wedding announcement. Not with Clara abandoning her ranch. Not with Ethan suddenly becoming a man who spoke easily about his feelings. They simply stopped pretending there was a reason to keep so much distance between their lives. The gate between the two properties stayed open most days. Clara brought bread across the creek when she baked too much, which soon became often enough that Ethan stopped believing it happened by accident. Ethan came over when a hinge sagged or a horse developed a limp, though he learned to ask before reaching for a tool. Sometimes Clara said she had it handled. Sometimes she handed him the hammer. Both answers became equally acceptable. When they ate together, Clara usually cooked. Ethan washed the dishes because she complained that he cut vegetables as though he were settling a personal dispute with them. By summer, Martha Reed had noticed. "So," she said one afternoon when Clara stopped at the restaurant for flour. "So what?" Martha folded her arms. "You've been buying twice as much coffee." Clara looked at the sack on the counter. "Ethan drinks a lot of coffee." "I imagine he does." Clara carried the flour out, without giving her the satisfaction